Welcome. I'll start us off. I know, Sky, you're like, who's going to get us started? So I'm Dr. Christine Norton. Some of you know me from my longtime involvement with the Association for Experiential Education. I am currently a social work professor at Texas State University. I do a lot of trainings on trauma-informed care, and I'm a licensed clinical social worker. But most important for this webinar is my role on the Social Justice Task Force with AEE. And this webinar came directly out of that work, and Sugar and Sky will let you know a little bit more about themselves and also some of the context for why we are offering this resource to those of you that had a workshop presentation accepted with AEE this year. So Sugar, you want to go?
Hi, everybody. I'm Dr. Kynetta Sugar McFarlane. I'm a clinical psychologist on my own private practice, Transformative Health, and I'm also the Equity Inclusion Coordinator for the Center of Innovative Practices at Case Western University. Say that twice. And part of the reason why I'm here outside of just being a member of the awesome Social Justice Committee, come check us out, is also because my expertise is working with traumatized youth and families, and to be a better organization, to be more affirming. The foundation of all of our work should be doing trauma informed care. And so we will be here to talk to you about that. But now I'm going to pass it to my colleague Sky.
Hi, everyone. My name is Sky. I'm the program manager at Valley of the Moon Children's Center, which is a center that serves kids who have been abused, neglected, or abandoned, and who have entered the foster care system. We are all trauma-informed care practitioners. I'm also a trauma-informed care trainer, as well as a master trainer for the ACEs trainings. And I am so committed to this work. I've seen the effects and the impacts of what trauma-informed care can do for not only kids who have suffered imaginable harms, but also in general in terms of how you include and basically integrate trauma-informed concepts within organizations. So very passionate about it and looking forward to sharing our experience, and very much looking forward to making sure the social justice agenda stays in the forefront of all of the workshop presenters. So thank you very much for joining us.
I
And you want
think,
to shout out that book you're holding?
oh yeah.
Yeah, let me just do a quick
Almo?
shout out. Dr. Nina Roberts, as many of you all know, was on the Social Justice Task Force, and unfortunately, she passed away to pancreatic cancer. As a result of her vision and our shared beliefs in social justice, a number of us got together, everybody who's on the screen right now, to forward her vision around creating a more just and compassionate world, and hence the Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Field Guide was published. If you haven't seen this, highly recommend you getting a copy. And there's also facilitation cards that go with it you can get from Michelle Cummings. All right.
Great. Well, we have a lot to cover. So Sky's going to just walk us through our agenda, kind of the objectives for today.
Yeah, absolutely. So we want to review the importance of psychological safety when facilitating in groups, which I'm sure we're all grounded in, but we can never take for granted what can come up in a workshop, right? People can get activated, and we need to be aware of that as we hold that safe and brave and accountable space. How to create authentic space and engagement, right? We want people to be able to authentically engage and bring who they are, their full selves into the workshop. And when people do that, we have to hold that space and make sure we're looking for signs and symptoms and areas where we need to pay closer attention, particularly if it's something that can be activating. We want to define trauma and the perspectives of race and equity. Dr. Kenneth Hardy says you cannot be trauma informed if you're not race informed. That's a super important concept that we need to really deepen our understanding of collectively as a community. We also need to understand the lasting impacts of trauma and the individual and the community risk factors related to trauma. Up here in Northern California, we have a number of risk factors, notwithstanding environmental impacts and wildfires that continue to rage as I speak right now in Northern California. Review trauma-informed care principles and define trauma-informed care facilitation and identify its key components. So that's what we're hoping to address today, and hopefully that will be helpful as you move into presenting your workshops in November.
Awesome. Do you want to talk a
We
little
also
bit?
want to make sure
Yeah.
we also want to make sure, as always, we're creating a space for transformation and growth. And what that requires of us as workshop facilitators and presenters is to understand the differences between a space, a safe space, a brave space, and an accountable space. So one example would be safe space is impossible for organizations to anticipate participants in evolving triggers. The brave space guidelines, an unbiased onus of bravery of marginalized communities to maintain bravery while sharing their lived experience to ensure allies can grow and learn from it. But most importantly, accountable space places an equal amount of focus for all to behave equitably, inclusively, to foster a deeper understanding of diverse lived experience in real time. And please refer to this and deepen your knowledge because it's super important to create that accountable space as we present and facilitate our workshops.
Awesome. And we will make the PowerPoint slide deck available as a link that goes along with the webinar for all of you. I think that accountable space, Sky, it really makes me think of the different phases of psychological safety. And I feel like if you're leading a workshop, we all will be leading a workshop there along with you. It's really important to ask yourself as a facilitator, are these types of emotional safety showing up? Is there inclusion safety where people feel safe to be themselves, including all the unique and beautiful attributes of their identity? Is there learner safety? Can people feel safe to ask questions and experiment and learn new things? That's at the heart of experiential education, is taking some of those risks, but we take for granted often as a facilitator if that safety is in place, if the container has been created so that people can take those risks without experiencing harm. We also need to make sure there's collaborator safety. Do people feel safe to contribute ideas, engage in dialogue, and work as a team? To me, this really speaks to a power sharing agreement. As a facilitator, if we're coming from a hierarchical perspective, we're not being trauma informed. We have to share power and collaborate with our workshop attendees, with our clients, with those that we serve. And then finally, and this is again that accountable space, is there that challenger safety? Are people in your workshop safe to speak up, expose issues, and even challenge the status quo with regard to ideas or things that are shared in the workshop? That's always an important thing to think of. So we're offering you this new framework of psychological safety and accountable space so you can actually build these containers first thing in your workshop as people walk into the room, creating that space for growth and transformation to happen. All right, move us forward.
And I just want to add one thing before Dr. Sugar steps in here. What Christine is talking about is actually what we're experimenting with here at Valley of the Moon. Christine was just up here doing a number of trauma-informed care trainings for us. And that psychological safety, as we build our short-term residential therapeutic program, which is a treatment program, we are embedding those same concepts into the organizational culture as we are in terms of working with our client group. So there's an integration of the concepts, both organizationally as well as within our program delivery. So just a really important piece to kind of hone in on. It's like a parallel process. So take us away, Kynetta. Sugar.
So you hopefully have heard about the ACE study. And when anybody is talking about ACEs, they're talking about adverse childhood experiences. So adverse childhood experiences are traumatic experiences that occur during a person's childhood. And these can include things from like seeing neighborhood or household violence, being abused, or growing up in a family where there's mental health problems or lack of support. We know that stressors from experiencing ACEs can change brain development and affect the way our bodies respond to stress, and is also linked to long term health problems. Now, when we look at the questions associated with the ACEs, they're broken down into three different categories. The first questions looked at abuse, so whether or not a person has experienced emotional, physical, or sexual abuse. Under the area of household difficulties, they looked at whether or not the mother was treated violently, was there substance use in the household, mental illness in the household, parental separation or divorce, or an incarcerated family member. And finally, looking at experiences of neglect, were you either emotionally or physically neglected? So When I'm talking to a family about like what is a trauma, I talk to them about a trauma is anything that happens to you that you can identify as scary, dangerous, violent, or some type of loss. Now, not everything that we experience that fits in that category will be traumatic to us. Like I've been in car accidents before and I still drive a car. So, not every experience will be traumatic to us. We say that an event is traumatic when it stresses us out too much and we can't actually cope with what has happened. And we should also recognize that traumatic experiences are very individualized. If me and Christine both experience the same thing, it could be traumatic to one of us and not traumatic to the other. So I really like this slide because it really talks to you about how traumas can affect a person over their lifetime. One of the first things that we should know about ACEs are that they're very common. About 64% of US adults have experienced at least one type of ACE, and about 20% of us have experienced four or more. And so when we think about before a person is even born, they could be being born into a culture that has experienced historical trauma. Somebody like me who comes from a history of enslavement. Then you have what is going on in like your social local context. So are you in an environment that has clean water? Are you in an environment that is safe? So what happens to you socially in your local context also affects you. Then you go through and experience negative events during your childhood. We know that these negative events can change up your neural development. And neural just means your brain development. So the way that your brain develops can be different in terms of now I need to like look for safety more than other people. So maybe now my reactions are quicker than other kids who don't have those worries. We know that it can affect you socially, emotionally, and cognitively just means how do you problem solve? We see that people who go through these experiences often have riskier behaviors with their health. They have more likelihood to have disease, to be more disabled, or to have more difficulties relating to other people socially. And all of these things can lead to somebody dying earlier. So it's really important to recognize how having and experiencing childhood um, negative experiences can lead to you having an earlier death.
And I want to just highlight, Sugar, we're not talking about other people. We're talking about us. We're talking about humanity. We're talking about not only the clients or students that you serve as an experiential education practitioner, but the people that walk through the door of your workshop are carrying and holding some of these exact things.
Yeah, really good clarification. It is us.
It's us.
Yeah. So, the National Survey of Children's Health is a survey that asks the normal ACE questions, but then also adds in this specific question. To the best of your knowledge, has your child ever been treated or judged unfairly because his or her race or ethnic group? Now, research shows that when we add in these questions about individual or interpersonal racism, when we look at children, Black children are more likely to have higher ACE scores than white children. And we also know that Black children are overrepresented among the children that experience two or more ACEs. Now, there's lots of research on the stress that's associated with systemic racism. So that's the racism that's built into the systems and structures of our country. So things like, depending on your race, I can tell that you're more likely or not likely to have health problems. You're more likely or not likely to experience poverty during your life. You're more likely or not likely to live in environments that have poor air quality or sound pollution. We also know that discrimination affects whether or not you're more likely to die, whether or not you actually have access to services, and whether or not you're more likely to encounter violence. And so the current ACE scales that we have really ignores that adverse childhood experience of living with institutional or systemic racism in America. We know that Native American, Latinx, Asian, and other groups of children in America who also experience the daily stress that's associated with having a minority status are not really getting accounted for. So, future research really needs to look at the experience of these groups because all of these experiences put children at risk for all the things that we see in this next slide.
Which I think is why your facilitation style has to mirror anti-oppressive practice, because if you're replicating the power dynamics of systemic and institutionalized racism that exist in our macro level context, if those oppressive dynamics are in your workshop, people will experience harm. So that anti-oppressive approach to facilitation is part of being trauma informed.
And these are all the risk factors that we see when children go through adverse childhood experiences. And as Christine just talked about, this is why we want to be trauma informed. We do not want to be putting children and families and adults who've experienced childhood traumas. We do not want to be putting them into situations where these are some of the long lasting outcomes from the work that we're doing with them. So, when we have communities that experience high levels of ACEs, these are the risk factors that we see. We see high levels of violence and crime. We see food insecurity. We see little community activities for the youth. We also see lots of stress in terms of social relationships, but also environmental in terms of how safe do I feel here? How calm can I be when I go outside?
Yeah. Guy, you want to do this one?
Yeah, so trauma-informed care, I think it's also just really important to note that trauma is pervasive. It is not like those people, as Christine and Sugar were saying earlier, the people in the participants in your workshop could have a high A score or no A score or everything in between. Again, trauma is pervasive and it impacts people at all socioeconomic levels as well as race and identification of who they are and where their social location is. So just want to like continue to drive that home so that we can normalize the fact that trauma does occur and it is pervasive. So trauma frequently occurs. ACEs has an impact on person's behaviors and functioning. We see that here on the daily with our kids that we work with. So often kids who have complex trauma or adults who have complex trauma who are working through or on their healing path, you can see some behaviors and they can act out that trauma. And sometimes it's very overt and sometimes it's covert, and it's important to read the room when you're presenting anything that potentially could be activating. Trauma affects the person, the staff, the helpers, and the system. As I talked about earlier, right now we are doing a trauma-informed care transformation throughout all of HSD, Human Services Division, and embedding systemic changes around our practices around race and equity and trauma-informed care as one example.
Yeah. I love that you gave the facilitators that are listening that little reminder about providing like an activation alert if they are going to be discussing sensitive material or topics in their workshop. You know, we've always heard, probably more than we want to, the phrase trigger warning. I think people are coming up with much better names for that now, but some kind of sensitive approach to the topics that are going to be discussed in the workshop, and making sure that participants are aware of that ahead of time as a means of informed consent so they can choose what they need in that moment to keep their nervous system safe. It might mean getting up and leaving the workshop, or it might mean more passive participation, but being really respectful of that. I love that. What have we been calling them, Sky? Activation alerts? Someone
Yes,
else had a great,
activating alerts.
great.
Yeah, as
Do
opposed to
you have
trigger.
any good
Yeah.
terms for
Exactly. So, the other thing I would just add to that as well is that when we're facilitating the workshops and, say, I know there's been examples of when a facilitator or a workshop presenter has been challenged by a participant. And, when you bring in the trauma-informed concepts, which we're going to go on a deeper dive later on in the webinar, just keep in mind to come from a compassionate, curious position as opposed to a defensive and threatening position, because that curiosity and compassion can open up and really maintain the safe space, the brave space, and the accountable space.
I know we're going to come back to this a little bit later when we talk about trauma-informed facilitation, but is there anything that either one of you want to say about some of these principles of trauma-informed care?
We're going to talk about it deeply, but just recognizing that this is like the base thing that we should be thinking about when we're like developing programs and thinking about how am I working with others? I'm going to be going back and make sure in terms of my checklist that I'm safe. I'm being open in terms of trust and transparency. So thinking about this as a checklist to go over before I'm going to do my presentation, before I develop my workshop with others.
I love
Yeah,
that.
and I'm just having a thought about peer support. We're embedding that. Again, Dr. Norton Christine helped us embed that into all of our divisions, and that's something I think we could also embed into AEE to create a peer support program that would be really helpful, just as we grow and learn with each other, and as an association. So,
I think
so
an example, yeah, and I think an example of that are some of the affinity groups that have been created to kind of
exactly.
hold safe space for, people identifying in different ways so they can come together and find that kind of common shared ground amidst sometimes a very overstimulating and overwhelming conference environment. But
Absolutely.
I agree that we could have more of that. Wonderful. Sugar?
So, secondary traumatic stress is really important for all of us to think about because, as we discussed, when we're talking about like adverse childhood experiences, those are not just experiences that happen to other people, they're likely experiences that happen to us. Post COVID, now everybody has gone through the experience of being traumatized.
Mhm.
Even if you're not from like a community where trauma is common. And so, as facilitators, being aware of secondary traumatic stress is important. So, that is the stress that happens when you hear about the traumatic experience that somebody else is going through. And it looks just like the symptoms of post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD. And it is very common in those who work with traumatized people. The range varies anywhere from 2% to 50%. And we do see that it is more likely to happen in certain one of us. And those of us who are naturally more empathetic, and that's likely a lot of us because that's partially why we go into this area of
Mhm.
facilitation, because often we want to help others or we can understand that perspective, that peer support that we were just talking about. But then also of those of us who have not resolved our own trauma, who have experienced ACEs and may not have done specific work to reduce that stress. For those of us who are having a high caseload of traumatized individuals, and for lots of us, that is our case.
Mhm.
All of the people that we're working
Yeah.
with are traumatized. Also, if you're a clinician that works in isolation. So, if you are a facilitator and you're in a team of like maybe two, or maybe you are the only one there, or you only get to check in so often with other teammates. And then finally, those who have a lack of training. And so, hopefully, just by you participating in this training right now, this will actually buffer you from getting some of these symptoms. And so I'm not going to go over the specific symptoms, but I want you to be able to look back at this slide to see Are these some of the things that I'm experiencing when I'm working with others? Are these some of the things that I'm experiencing even when I'm not? These are all indicators that I likely need some more help because I'm feeling very stressed out.
All right. So that was a quick but deep dive into trauma. What is trauma? Trauma-informed care approaches. Thank you both so much, Sky. I know you might have to leave us a little early. But really the impetus for this whole conversation is about what does this have to do with facilitation and experiential education? I think we've done a good job of kind of bringing you along and connecting those dots in the sense that we want you to create engaging and transformational experiences for your workshop participants. The AEE International Conference has always been such a high activity, high connectivity event, but it can also be overwhelming. And we are bringing ourselves to this new environment, being around a lot of different people, learning a lot of new things, also being asked to sometimes step out of and expand our comfort zone through activities in the workshops. We might also hear things that we don't agree with, or even that kind of activate our nervous system a little bit. And so we want to help you avoid that re-traumatization and deal with the trauma that might come up, the trauma responses in your workshop that might prevent authentic engagement. And we really believe that the biggest way of creating those meaningful opportunities for voice and choice is to collaborate with your workshop participants, to be checking in with them. A lot of times we think in experiential education that we do the activity and then we reflect on it at the end. And I think we all know that that's kind of a passé model, that really we understand people are bringing their lived experience into the room. And that's the first thing we have to attend to and honor and create a container for. And then they're also bringing their pre-story about what's this workshop about? What are these? Why are there webbing out on the floor? They're already constructing a story. And that story might be a story of safety and excitement, or it might be a story of trauma and defensiveness because of their past lived experience. And so checking in with people throughout is going to be one of the ways of giving voice and choice. And also, we talk a lot in experiential education about challenge by choice. Even that concept is being looked at more critically, because again, Sugar, you said this earlier, what's challenging, what's traumatic for you might not be traumatic for me. Same thing with this concept of challenge, right? It might be really challenging for me to talk to someone new, but it might not be for you. So when we say challenge, it kind of assumes uniformity. I like to say, what is the optimal level of participation that you need from this workshop to be able to get something from it when you leave, right? And Sky does a brilliant job with her staff and trainings of talking about there are definitely different forms of participation. There's more active and engaged forms, and there's more passive forms. And even that term is a little bit, we kind of judge that word, but really being more passive is a way of being a better observer, of being able to take things in through different senses. We really prioritize language, talking, and extroversion. And so remembering these things as we're facilitating. So I've kind of worked at defining this. What is trauma-informed facilitation as an approach to leading groups or workshops that acknowledges and integrates an understanding of trauma, right? So we gave you a baseline understanding of the neurobiology of trauma, how it affects our brains and bodies, how it's based on and also exacerbated by historical and generational trauma and community risk factors. So you know that now, you have that information. And so you have a new understanding and awareness of its effect on individuals and groups that you're teaching and training. And so this approach is really relevant in settings where participants may have experienced trauma, such as therapy groups, support groups, educational workshops, community programs. We
Event programs, the list
that
goes on, right?
the list goes on. Outdoor programs, especially, right? It does. It's really, and I think the reason why it's so ubiquitous is because trauma is so prevalent. It used to be that we only thought about trauma like, oh, well, I don't run a therapeutic program, so I don't have to worry about that. It's like, well, I think we all know that we are living in really traumatizing times. And like Sugar said, we've all experienced trauma from the pandemic, but the ongoing ACEs that people are having to deal with because of a lack of social and environmental protective factors and determinants of health is just going to continue. And so we as facilitators, we need to have a mindset for what does that look like? So what we did is we took some of the key components of trauma-informed care and we brought them into facilitation. And so again, some of this is redundant to what we've talked about in the workshop. I don't just want to read the slides, but I do want you to know that first and foremost, your job as a facilitator of a workshop or of a group setting of any kind, when you bring human beings together, is to create, maintain, and if necessary, repair physical and emotional safety. That is your job as the facilitator. And so a lot of times facilitators get stuck if they see a dynamic happening and they're like, oh, this doesn't feel right. And so one of the things that we do as a facilitator is to name, right? And notice and name and be a compassionate and non-judgmental mirror back. The other thing that we do is we create group norms for a safe and brave space, right? I do that in my classroom. I do that on a wilderness expedition. I do it in a faculty meeting. Doesn't always work as well there, but right, like we want to have those group norms for what does the group need today before we even start the workshop to have a positive experience together, right? Part of doing that is to create a space that feels welcoming, non-threatening, free from judgment. And so we have to establish those clear guidelines. We also want to build trust by being transparent about the structure. Like, here's what we're going to do today. I think sometimes experiential educators, we think like, ooh, we've got like the white rabbit in the hat we're going to pull out and surprise everyone. And maybe there's an element to novelty that and unexpectedness in the learning process that is important, but there should still be that informed consent where people know what they're signing up for. And I've made that mistake. How many of you, before you're about to do an experiential activity, say, okay, can I get 5 volunteers? Well, it's like, am I volunteering as tribute or am I just going to throw some koosh balls? Like, I don't know what I'm signing up for, you know? So letting people know we're going to do this activity. Here's what it entails. Now, could I get 5 volunteers, right? That's just a simple tweak to help people feel that sense, to be more transparent. And then it gives people empowerment and choice. They get to say, I'm all in. I love koosh balls. Or they get to say, nope, not today, right? And here's what we have to start doing a better job of: trusting our participants. I think it's funny as educators and therapists and practitioners of experiential education, one of the key things we want for our students is to learn to tune in to their own needs and then to be able to advocate for those needs. But how often are we like, kind of nicely cheering people on, slashing, coercing them to come on, it'll be great, let's do it, and I am guilty of that, right? Because I'm a cheerleader. And so sometimes cheerleaders can take away, people's autonomy because we're so excited. So just also like know yourself, and consider what your participants need to really have a choice in participating in things in your workshop. I'm going to pause for a second because I just covered safety, trustworthiness, and transparency, empowerment, choice. Sky or Sugar, any things that are jumping out at you?
The biggest thing that I would say is also be really open to feedback in terms of the collaboration and mutuality. One of the things that I think that can happen is that we take on this power role of the expert and really don't recognize how like everybody's an expert in
Yeah.
terms of like I'm an expert in terms of how my body feels, and that's information that you can't be an expert at. And so really being open to knowing that part of doing in trauma informed care is being able to recognize that it's likely for me to make a mistake and being able to like own that, and that being a part of like the respect that we're doing, but then also part of that collaboration and mutuality.
Oh,
Yeah, I say second and third that, Sugar. And the last thing I would add is the piece around that I mentioned earlier around curiosity and compassion.
yeah.
Like if you can lead with that, with those concepts, even if you're getting feedback or there's something happening in your workshop that you have to tend to, if you stay in that space, it's just so much easier to navigate through and use the power of the group to help with that process.
Yeah. I love that one of the things, Sugar, you said, like, we get into this power role. And one of the things I think I've learned the most over the 30-year span of being an experiential educator, I'm not done learning, but one of
Never
the best things from a trauma-informed and race and equity-informed perspective is to de-center myself. It is not
Yes.
about me. It's not about me as the facilitator. It's about the group and their learning. And going through this list again, moving into respect for diversity, it's about what kind of environment am I creating and what experiential opportunities am I, inviting people to participate in where they feel a sense of engagement, right? And they feel also like they can engage fully as themselves. And this gets into that piece about identity and not, I remember we used to say like tolerance was the goal. And I'm thinking like, no, this is about trauma-informed care is about celebrating diversity and really promoting that diversity, is actually our greatest gift in experiential education, because experiential education involves taking something that needs or requires some problem solving. And so to get diverse perspectives on a problem is exactly what our world, right, is kind of lacking right now and needs more than ever. So when we can create that in our workshops, we're actually opening up like a whole new way of problem solving in our world. And it can be so exciting, and it helps us get out of the way.
Yes,
Beautiful.
beautifully said.
So a few more trauma-informed facilitation hacks, if you will. Right, we already talked about understanding trauma impact. Here's what I want to say about that. If someone in your workshop is dysregulated, right? They're upset, they're angry, maybe they're shutting down. There's all kinds of internalizing and externalizing things you might see. What I always do is think, oh my God, that person hates me. They don't like my workshop. Oh my God, I make it about me, right? That's not trauma informed. Then that gets into my own stuff. Or some people get real defensive, like, oh, how dare they? I have my PhD and blah, 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 right? Either way, don't make it about you, right? That's the trap. Look at it as just a human response to maybe not feeling safe in the moment. Anytime I have something happen like that, I ask the question, I'm noticing that, you're kind of taking a back seat on a lot of these activities, and I'm absolutely okay with that. But I'm also wondering, is there something that I could do as a facilitator? And again, this is kind of that pull aside conversation to help you feel more comfortable. I want to make sure that everyone's feeling really supported. And a lot of times people will be like, oh no, I'm good. I'm just tired today. And I'll go, great. But I have had people say, yeah, I feel like there's too many side conversations happening and I don't like it. And I don't feel like you're doing anything about it. And I go, oh, okay. Right. So doing those kinds of check-ins with people, knowing that it's not personal, they're having a response to the environment, which Sugar's going to talk about here in a second, and to be curious about that. Sky and I were at a conference together and doing a very unrelated workshop, but it was at the original time close to some of the attacks happening in the Middle East. And there was a workshop participant who heard me mention something like, I just want to be sensitive that I know this is a really painful time in our world. And he came up to me and said, that's not what this workshop's going to be about, is it? While everyone was in like a small group, and he was really activated because his family was being affected by that trauma. And I, in that moment, turned to him and I said, no, that's not what this workshop is about. I just wanted to try to hold space for that. I recognize that activated something in you. And I want to make sure you know I'm not going to pry into that. I'm not going to make you talk about that. And I also want to see what I can do right now in this moment to just help you feel safe again. Because I took him out of his body by even mentioning it. Right. And so we just kind of had this moment together, and he had a sigh of relief that I wasn't going to dig and it wasn't going to be something I talked about. And we took some deep breaths together. And I asked him, I said, you know, if you feel like, or I said, I guess, if you feel like you need to leave the workshop, like I'm cool with that. I'm not gonna, it's fine. Whatever you need to sit in the back. He goes, no, I'm good. He goes, but just knowing that I can, just knowing that I can take care of myself in whatever way I need, guess what? That helped him stay. That helped him stay and engage. So, you know, we get these opportunities. And that I think goes right into flexibility and adaptability. Be flexible. One of the greatest gifts of being an experiential educator is you go in with a plan and then you throw that plan out the window because you're showing up for who your participants are. The other thing is for you, have that good self-care and boundaries. You know, come into your workshop feeling like you've been taking care of yourself. And also, you kind of know what you can and can't give in that space. I've had people ask me things about my life during a workshop, and I've kind of had to redirect them. Like, I understand that you're interested in that, but I want to kind of stay on topic because for me, it felt too personal. So just be okay taking care of yourself in the moment as well. And then, Sugar, you talked about this feedback, right? Not only like tolerate feedback, but seek it. You know, if you notice your group's kind of flat, kind of maybe say, hey, I'm noticing people's energy kind of dipped. Do people need a break? You know, we're doing these 3-hour workshops now. That's a marathon. We even do the PDIs now. That's a long day. So keep checking in. And then, you know, finally, just know this is a growth journey. We're not coming from an expert place. We're coming from our lived experience as facilitators that have done a lot of things well and then also made some big mistakes. But it's our love for this process of experiential education and our desire for AEE as social justice task force members to be a really safe and engaging place of belonging for everybody that's driving us to do this work. So we hope you'll come on this journey with us of continuous learning and improvement. And I do want to turn it over to Sugar for kind of a final piece, not just about how you facilitate, but about the actual environment that you create.
So before we go there, I just wanted to jump in with one more example because I think the more lived experience examples we can give to you all, the better. And so all three of us have helped present a lot of workshops on the diversity, equity, inclusion field guide. And part of the workshop is reading the stories of lived experience of the people who've been impacted in some one way or another by injustices. And that can bring up a lot. And we've had moments where people have been overcome by their emotions, and we've had to really look at how do we continue to make sure we front load as much as possible and not take for granted at all that people can be by reading these stories, it can tap into their own unresolved issues or their own lived experience or their own traumas. So again, this is another example that we're continuing to hone in on as we continue to do these workshops, and we'll be presenting it again this year with even more front loading.
Yeah,
So I just wanted to put that out there as well.
that's a good example. Thanks, Sky.
So Sugar.
So so that first one makes me laugh as like I'm talking to the spiritual educators. Okay, so 90% of normal people spend their time indoors.
But
I
a
know
lot of
y'all don't. I know.
workshops,
No, I'm
a lot
messing
of
with you.
our
I'm messing.
workshops
It's a
are
joke. It's a
inside.
joke. It's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke. It's a joke. Like thinking about the crowd. I'm thinking about the crowd. Am I
Yeah.
not supposed to be responding to who I'm talking to? So a lot of y'all work outdoors, but most of us are indoors most of the time. Like most of us are indoors 90% of the time. And it's really important for us to think about how our environment is because it affects like our mood. It affects how we react. It affects the attitude that comes into the space. And so Christine just gave that example in terms of her making sure that the person understood the rules in the environment in terms of we're not here to dig. You can do things to make yourself and your body feel comfortable. And it immediately affected their mood and behavior.
Yeah,
And so this is really about how do we help people regulate to be able to cope with stress.
yeah, I love that. And I was laughing, Sugar, what I was laughing about was how we often are indoors at the AE conference. Some workshops go outside, but some are in rooms, like you walk in to give your workshop and you're like, oh, this room might not be conducive to the environment I was hoping to create. And so, we end up moving the furniture and trying to get things set up. And so the built environment can be sometimes a barrier that we have to still kind of deal with, even at an AE conference.
So, when we're looking at creating a trauma-informed facilitation, experience, environment, these are another checklist that you can use to check off to see whether or not this environment is actually sensitive to my participants. And so when we're doing trauma-informed work, the number one overall thing all the time: safety, 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 safety. So we always want to be making sure that we look at safety. So what does that mean? For some people, it's accessibility. Somebody who has splints and stuff, being in a room where I feel like I can actually fit, I can actually move my body here, like there's support for me here. That's a part of safety. So recognizing again that these definitions mean different things to different people. So as a facilitator, there will be some things that I anticipate, but then that's that part of being adaptive and flexible to be able to change up things based off of what do people bring into the room. So we're thinking about things of connection to like nature. So if I can't bring nature into the room, maybe I can bring some like audio sounds into the room because I'm in an all enclosed environment. And so these are just some ideas for you to be thinking about. What are the elements that I want to think about when I'm facilitating? What are the things that I'm making sure that I'm doing at the end of the day to make this actually accessible space for everybody, a safe space for everybody? And if we can really do a good job of making people feel safe, then we should feel like we are doing a good job of actually performing trauma-informed care, not only to ourselves, which is important, but also to our community, to the people that we're facilitating to.
Right. And that's in an environment like that, that's where I can actually learn and play and grow.
Yeah,
Right.
Yeah.
absolutely.
So I just want to give my amazing colleagues an opportunity to just say kind of any final words. We know that that was like a whirlwind intro, and really just we wanted to offer it to you all as facilitators. We want to say thank you for putting in a proposal. We want to say congratulations for getting a proposal accepted. And we want to say that we are here to support you in making sure that your workshop is the best that it can be. And we really hope that this trauma-informed facilitation segment is just a building block for you to continue to reach a broader group of people and continue to create an environment that's inclusive and belonging for everyone. So that's my final spiel, but I want to offer Sugar and Sky a chance to say something too.
I just want to say thank you so much for helping like enrich the environment of AEE through the education that you're going to be providing to everyone, and to remind you that we're also here as part of the Social Justice Committee to provide peer support. So if you have like any questions, part of us all being trauma informed like facilitators is to be able to be here to answer questions and to also assure you that mistakes are normal and healthy. We often forget that like actually making mistakes is part of like the learning process. And so hopefully that you can be open to feedback and you can feel safe and comfortable. And thank you for sharing your knowledge with the community.
Yeah, and I'll just speak briefly just to say it's been a pleasure and an honor to do this webinar with Christine and Sugar, who are amazing human beings and trauma-informed care practitioners, and who actually all live a trauma-informed life, which is super cool, right? I want to end with a quote because again, this is all about social justice and DEIB work. And Dr. Nina Roberts says, we must learn to challenge systems, change institutions and injustices and more. We must do our part to show up, speak up, and not tolerate hate or injustice. Be brave, be bold, be inspirational. Now is the time for new changes and transformation. In the process, reach deep down to share empathy. Be patient with yourself and each other. and be authentic in your exchange of love, laughter, fear, and hope.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
y'all. We
everybody.
appreciate you. Let us
Yep.
know if you have any
Can't wait to
questions.
see you in Estes Park.
That's right. Up in the
Shout out to
mountains.
AEE.
Feel free to reach out if you need anything.
Yeah.